A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Once again, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Now, this series, My Community, has a number of objectives and goals, one of which, of course, is the fostering of unity and a sense of belonging. When community members see and hear their stories represented on television, it fosters a sense of unity and belonging and reinforces the idea that their experiences and contribution matter. And this creates a stronger sense of community identity. As Daniel Holder continues his tour of the magic and energy that made Whitehall, he begins by reminding us that musicians seem to have had a special affinity to his community, or put differently, the community was home to a number of musicians.
Yeah, Sherwood, you know, we have spoken about a few people who lived in Whitehall, people who were very much involved in music, people like Lord Rady and so on. But there were others who either resided in the area or frequented the area often enough. I remember Phyllis Cullum of Froggy, the Calypsonian. Her mother lived in the area, so she was a frequent visitor to the area. And in fact, she had a song about Mama put two dumplings in the pot. And she had made that song actually about some children whom her mother had adopted. So Charlie is actually a person. You know, she says in the song, Charlie's the man with the miracle hand. And Charlie take the dumplings out the pot because it was hot, really. But I knew Charlie personally because as boys we grew up together and so on. Interestingly enough, John Yard, the gospel singer, now Calypsonian, is a young man who was raised in Whitehall as well. And in addition to that, there was Bell Small, who was a well-known jazz musician, a bass guitarist. He used to play in the Bel Air Club and so on. He would have played with people like Ernie Small and so on. He lived in Whitehall as well. Norris Williams, who was the organist at St. Stephen's Parish Church. St. Stephen's Church, rather, he lived in Whitehall. He used to teach music lessons, piano lessons, and so on. And I go on to add Andrew Loki.
A young man himself who has succeeded in molding a group of Barbadian schoolboys from his alma mater into a nationally and internationally acclaimed and award-winning choir in just a few years. Mr. Loki, who has trained many other choirs across Barbados, is not only a classically trained musician, but a teacher of French and Spanish who inspires his students to excel.
He is a Whitehall boy as well. So it is interesting that over the years we have had a number of people involved in music who have come out of Whitehall. I mean, Lord Rady's son, Arthur, he was born and raised in Whitehall, and he went on to have his own group and so on. And I want to remember, because I mentioned Lord Rady after practice, sort of warming down, would make up these songs on us as we gathered around. But he also, some of his associates, here and there, he made some songs off of it. There was one called The Hungry Man from Hillaby. I don't know if you know that one, but it's interesting. My voice is a bit husky today, but just a verse or so, which goes, the man is known around the town. The man is known as a good food hound. He never eat at home nor on the street. He's a hungry man from Hillaby. One day the hungry man went down to hell. The devil said, man, you did well. He lift up the devil and throw him in the ground and eat up all the devil night gone. The man is known around the town. The man is known as a good food hound. He never eat at home nor on the street. He's a hungry man from Hillaby. So those are the kinds of songs, kind of folksy and so on. I said that was an associate of his. And he, in Belgian parlance, made up this song, composed a song of this gentleman who lived in the area. Apart from the musicians, there were tradesmen, artisans, and so on. Winfield Bellamy, I mentioned already, he had his origins in Whitehall, and he was a tinsmith at the time. Later on, got fully involved in automotive repairs in terms of mechanics and body work. But we also had Mr. Rochester, who had a pretty large mechanic workshop on Whitehall Main Road, and he used to do a lot of work for some of the commercial houses in Barbados. And speaking of him, he did a lot of work for Purity and the Diamond Bakery at the time. And he had an association with a gentleman called Cardinal Elcock, who incidentally was my stepfather. And he painted all of those vans, not the paint in terms of the body, but the artwork. And I found it an amazing thing. Here's a man who had no formal training in this field, a man in the absence of computer graphics and all of these things, stencils, whose work was really exquisite. And I remember, well, he did the sign at one time for the Whitehall Church, the sign. But I mean, the lettering was something out of this world. He was naturally very talented, and he was one of the people in the area, one of the artisans. Then we had the butchers, essentially two people. There was Ray Side, who was a butcher who would usually do most of his work on Saturdays and Sundays. During the week, he would you know, as a thing, he would gather or go throughout the village and beyond and buy livestock, and then he would slaughter on Saturdays and Sundays. And I find it interesting when we think of inflation and so on. Can you imagine buying a pound of pork for 50 cents? that was the price then. You would go up to the butcher shop on Sunday morning, and because, you know, in the days when there wasn't much refrigeration about in terms of people having fridges and so on, they went invariably to the butcher shop, sometimes on Saturday, but more so on Sundays. But then there was another man in the area who was a butcher. I think that he missed his calling. I think in another world with opportunities, he would perhaps have been a surgeon. He was really good at this thing. And he took a pride in this thing. He carried a bag in which he had a section for each knife, and each knife had a particular purpose and so on. And to see him, I mean, delicately executing his skills as a butcher, he was really good. And also to see him castrating young, you know, the male pigs and so on. He really took a pride and a delight in that. For him, it was not just doing a job. It was art. It was skill. I mean, Rick was really good, to be admired. And like I said, I believe he missed his calling, and another day he would have been, you know, thing. And then we had Alfred Hines, who was a well digger. I always find it amazing. I used to go around and help them haul stone out of the wells when they had, you know, dug the stone or so. But I find it amazing that these fellows would go deep down into a well, light the dynamite, and then they would have to come up. So the thing had to be long enough so that they would be able to get out, cover the well, and then to get a safe distance. And what happens sometimes is that they would like 3 holes or so, and only 2 would blow. And then imagine have to go back down inside of that well with an unexploded piece of dynamite. I mean, but they did it, and I never heard of any of them getting injured or anything, because, again, we sometimes think it was a rather simple task, but it wasn't. These men had a skill. I mean, they were really good. We had Mr. Redmond, who lived on the main road. He was a clock and a watch repairer. We had Mr. Graham. He was a shoemaker. His nickname was Backlash. I don't know where he got the name Backlash, but he had his head was totally bald not a hair, not a follicle, I mean, say, and he had this beard, you know, that with a head looking like that and a beard like that. He looked like a storybook character. I think I often thought that what happened in terms of his head and his beard is that his hair had migrated from his head to his chin. And perhaps that explained this nice, lovely beard that Backlash had. But he was good at being a shoemaker, really good. And of course, you know, there's people invariably bought leather shoes because it was the thing. We didn't have a lot of synthetic material around and so on. So it was quite easy to get your shoes repaired. And I could see him now with all in hand and so on. And, you know, really get into work. Again, it is interesting, you know, that these people went beyond just doing a job. I think that often enough when they had finished the job, they'd step back and perhaps like God at creation, that this is not blasphemous, but this thing step back and said to that. They wanted to see that it was good, not just to do a job. They took pride in their thing. We also had Mr. Payne, who was a gardener. And I suppose people might think, hey, a gardener, quite an ordinary thing. No, he was a gardener at Warren's Great House. He was good. I really mean good. So much so that he got a lot of private work. People who could afford it, and who saw his work, engage his services to do their gardens for him. So that is how good Mr. Payne was. But then we had Mr. Harper. He was on the main road. He had a shop there as well. You had Louise, and we would say, remember I talked about up in the back. Her shop was in the tenantry. She ran a shop there. You had Miss Lynch, who ran a shop just on the border of Whitehall and Grisette's. That was a kind of hideaway because of where it was located. And you could go there and play bingo, not the bingo that was done on the radio and so on, JSEs and so on, but she ran a bingo game where you could come, there was a bag, and you know, and people would got cards and they would play there at her shop. And then you had Miss Ward. Now, Miss Ward sold from in her window, but she had a glass case there. And this is the place where you could go and buy cotton, common pins, needles, Vicks and those kind of things. And you could also buy Vaseline, because the Vaseline, you could buy 3 cents or 4 cents in Vaseline. The 3 cents was brown Vaseline and the 4 cents was the white Vaseline, right? And of course, in those days when people did a lot of their pressing, as we say at home, using those ironing combs, and you know of those ironing combs that sometimes when you start to pull them through the air, the grease, you hear this sizzling down. Of course, sometimes the ladies, the young ladies, found that they got themselves burnt from this exercise. But that in the absence of modern hairdressing, salons, and so on, that is what it was like. On the other hand, there was a man called Mr. Clinton who was a barber, but he also was the local pharmacist. He operated a drugstore there. And of course, you could go and get those things like turpentine and jade fluid and these things. And, you know, but as boys, we used to look for bottles. So this bottle thing is nothing new, by the way. We used to go and look for bottles, particularly vials, and we would wash them out and we would sell them to him, because then he'd be able, with the bottles and so on, to have them to bottle the turpentine, jade fluid, and other things, mentholated spirits, which people use then. And yeah, and he was always a man very neat, very tidy, and so on. There was a brother and sister. There was Violet White. She was a seamstress. And her brother, Rupert White, he was one of the village tailors, right? And I think their great niece, Maria Theodore, we call her, still has she might still have their machine, one of their machines at home, which is pretty old, right? Then there was a lady further up the road, Gertie Bascom, who was also a seamstress. Yeah, so I mean, in every village you had to have somebody who would be making the clothes for the weddings. You just simple things, and you just pull a piece of tarpaulin, canvas off the house onto the paling and whatnot. The weddings were kept there. But of course, the people in the village donated, they gave. So you said to them, no formal invitation, my daughter's getting married, my son is getting, okay, and they would raise a little, or say, okay, I have a sheep there, or I have a pig, or lots of coconut water used to get at weddings. And fruit. Yeah, lots of coconut water, and lots of bananas. These are things that people donated. You know, so there wasn't. There was plenty of food at weddings. Right? People were generous. People were, you know, that was the nature of people then. So food was not a thing that you had to look for. Perhaps the thing you had to look for was the suit for the gentleman and the wedding dress for the lady. Sometimes if you had a close association with the seamstress, that would be her gift to the young lady to make the wedding dress for her, or the tailor to make the suit for you. Some people who provided a taxi service, particularly to funerals, and you know the idea of getting a sitting in a and I remember having gone to a funeral with my grandmother sometime back, and we go to the funeral. It was one of these old cars, and the fella had to get out and insert the crank handle and start it. So I give you some ideas, because the car with like a running board and so on, and how old it was. Sometimes it was difficult to separate in terms of how people function. Cave Hill, which the nearby area, just as a button and a bounding. A friend of mine I mentioned, Oscar, his father, whose name was Oscar, but he was Oscar Senior Oscar World, had a truck, a Chevrolet, and this thing had the bonnet was long and so on. But I remember him cranking the truck and so on, and we used to go and help to on the truck during crop time. Again, you know, here was a man who started a business, so to speak. Yeah, because people did that. Again, I say we talk about, you know, glibly about entrepreneurship. These people didn't see themselves necessarily, well, term was perhaps not around then in use, entrepreneurs, but saw opportunities for them to establish some means of independence, and so they did. I mentioned the bakery as an example. Esther Wickham as another example in terms of her local confectionery. Mr. Hewitt, in terms of being a contractor, house builder, etc. My grandmother was a village washerwoman. She used to wash clothes and so on for people. I remember she used to wash clothes for some people, the Seals, who live opposite what then subsequently became the supermarket. It's an amazing thing how a person using a coal pot or a stove could, you know, clean white clothes and have them lily white. I remember as a boy, and I said I mentioned she used to go to town on Saturday. She would go to town primarily to get coals for her coal pot. And she would have these clothes. I mean, she would have them bleaching on the rocks, and I would have to wet them, you know, as she was away. But I remember her pressing these things, and I told her it's an amazing thing with a kerosene oil lamp and seeing to get them done and for them to be lily white. Good. Of course, she used to use something in those days called blue that you would add to the water to help keep these clothes and bring out the whiteness in them. many of those businesses, and I mentioned the bakery at the top of Whitehall, number 3, many of those businesses have disappeared, but now there are a set of new businesses. There's on the main road, Watkins Management and Financial Services. Then there is in the Bradford Gap that I had mentioned earlier, there's Austin's, a gentleman there who does repairs and maintenance of solar water heating systems. And on the main road, there is a business which has been established for a few years now. It is a nursing school. It is called Allied Health Institute. And there are classes run for auxiliary nurses. It is, as far as, it is a fully accredited school. So once the young ladies go there and they get the certificate from there, it's fully accredited, recognized by the Barbados Accreditation Council and so on. So businesses have emerged in terms of not necessarily replacing, but modern demands as they go. That place, the Allied Health Services Institute, when you pass and you see the young ladies at class, all clad in their white and so on. It's run by a lady called Dorel Holder. Right. And there's some other businesses, some people have taken, again, you know, small things to selling drinks and so on. Good, but times have changed. Of course, now one bakery has gone, but some years later, in a sense, replaced by another, World's Bakery in Whitehall, number 1.
The change in scenes as evidenced by development in the area. We will get back to other businesses in the community, but let us take a look now at families.
Now, the Roach is an interesting family. They would have had, the brothers were Noel, Neville, Exley, and Michael, and the sisters were Yolene and Eileen, right? One of them, of those sisters, was married to Brazilian Bab, right? But they had a business. He had trucks, which transported usually marl, that kind of stuff. But near them, he had a rock crusher, right? And his son actually was very creative. He made a model boat. And if you look at this thing, very intricate thing, you look inside it, you can see all of that. And he, from time to time, would place it in the tank that would cool down the water we use the thing. Then he built some excellent bird cages. He also got into birds. He had lovebirds, budgies, peacocks, and so on. He had monkeys. And years ago, if you went to Queen's Park and you saw peacocks and these other birds, there were Exleys that were in the park. And then for the whole town festival, he would also have exhibits there, the birds and the monkeys, turtles, and so on. Their place was a place of center of activity because we used to assemble there, play games, and then there were these cycling races because 2 of his sons, particularly Exley and Michael, had bicycles, and other fellows would, and they would race from down by, the sprints were from by Rockdunda Park and finished there by Roach's place where we would assemble at night. Yeah, and they again had their own, beyond Whitehall, they own a shop and a quarry in Long Gap. And of course, a village in Barbados cannot be a village unless there are churches. You must, because the shop and the church, 2 essential parts of a village. And there at the top of Whitehall, as you enter from Codrington, is the Assembly Hall on the right-hand side of the road. Then at one time, Ebenezer Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is now located in Eden Lodge, actually started in Whitehall in Medford Road. Yeah, but they saw the need to have a bigger space, a bigger building, and so they moved over to Eden Lodge. That's a stone's throw away because these are adjoining villages. You also have on Medford Road the Ebenezer Revival Center, which has been around for a long time. In recent times, the Bradford Life Adventist Church on the main road has joined the churches in the area. So well represented in terms of denomination, of course, just outside of the village. Stone's throw away is the Anglican Church, Christ the King. I went to Whitehall Methodist Church in the morning. By the evening, I had to go to Sunday school at the Church of Resurrection in Green Hill. The usual thing, so you got to church two times a day on Sundays. Okay? The church, Whitehall Methodist Church, is an interesting church. I'm told in 1955 when Jeanette struck that it was a hurricane shelter, and told by my grandmother and so on that at the top, the arch there, the roof started to crack. Yeah, interesting. Of course, I should say that church provides an excellent view of the harbor. I still go there from time to time, reminiscing and looking over and enjoying the beautiful view, really picturesque that it provides. Well, you overlook Grisettes, you look right on along Gap onto and you look into Bridgetown as well, the Central Bank and so on. You can see the Hilton and all of those larger buildings in Bridgetown. There was a church. I will not call the name. I don't want to offend anybody because of what we used to call it as boys. We used to call it the Jump Up Church. And we enjoyed revival because Josie Hill and so on in those days, those trucks which had been converted into buses would come down. This was a wooden church. And when the music was really going and so on, the floor would just be up and down and so on. And we as boys would be looking in. Good. But for us, and people must understand the context, for us as boys, that was fun. I mean, as grown men, we wouldn't see it as fun now, but then everybody liked to go across by the church at revival time, you know, because it was a nice time to be had, so to speak. So the village over the year has been well served by various denominations. And also, it is interesting enough that years ago, there was a lady in the village called Miss Boyce on the main road who used to keep Sunday school class in her gallery on Sunday evenings. I know of another case in the adjoining village where that used to happen too. But it used to happen on Friday evenings where children would leave school and go by this lady and have classes.
Yet another fine example of how older members in the community saw it as their responsibility to be a part of the children's development, and that, of course, involved the provision of religious instructions. Speaking of things of a religious nature, we go out this week on a lighter note.
There was a couple in the village, and elderly couple, the wife was a very avid church goer. The opposite can be said of the husband. And we had this joke. Sometimes she said to him, you know, he was a Sobers. She was fed up with his not going to church. So, Mr. Sobers, I'm going to throw your clothes through the window. And he said, surely you go behind them too.
Well, we're not going behind, neither are we going after the close, but we're going to meet with Daniel Holder next week at the same time as he continues his presentation of the mini-series on the community of Whitehall, St. Michael. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.
St. Michael.